Ayaan Verma did not hate love loudly. He did not argue about it in public, nor did he mock couples openly. His rejection of love was quiet, controlled, and deeply internal. He treated love the way one treats a beautiful but dangerous animal, admiring it from a distance, never trusting it enough to come close. At 32, Ayaan was successful, respected, and emotionally unreachable. He worked as a senior creative producer in the film industry, a place built on emotions he refused to feel. Every day, he approved romantic scripts, edited passionate dialogues, and supervised scenes meant to make audiences cry. And every day, he walked away untouched. People assumed he was strong. In truth, he was guarded. Love to Ayaan was not a miracle, it was a mistake people willingly repeated. His disbelief was not born from philosophy but from memory. Ayaan grew up in a home where love was promised but never practiced. His father had been charming, expressive, and emotionally generous until he was. Slowly, affection turned into absence. Promises turned into explanations, and explanations turned into silence. Ayaan remembered his mother waiting by the window every evening, pretending not to hope. He remembered learning early that love could vanish without warning. That lesson stayed. While others learned poetry from heartbreak, Ayaan learned control. He promised himself that no emotion would ever make him weak enough to wait for someone who might not return. As an adult, Ayaan mastered the art of emotional detachment. He dated casually, never long enough to create expectations. He listened attentively but revealed nothing personal. Women often described him as kind but distant, attractive but unreadable. When relationships ended, they ended cleanly, no drama, no explanations. Ayaan believed he was being honest by never offering more than he could give. In reality, he was hiding from the one thing he feared most, emotional dependence. The film industry suited him perfectly. Romance was everywhere, yet never required authenticity. Emotions were scripted. Love had retakes. Pain could be edited out. He liked that control. On sets, he was admired for his calm decision-making and sharp instincts. Directors trusted him. Actors respected him. He was the man who could shape emotion without feeling it, and he took pride in that. Then one morning, a new assistant director joined the project. Her name was Ira Noor. Ira arrived without noise or announcement, carrying nothing but a notebook filled with handwritten thoughts and a quiet confidence that unsettled Ayaan from the very first day. She was not dramatic, not loud, not eager to impress. She observed before she spoke, and when she did speak, it was with clarity and warmth that made people listen. Ira believed stories mattered. She believed emotions were not weaknesses but bridges. And unlike most people in the industry, she didn't perform sincerity, she lived it. Ira's belief in love was not naive. It was intentional. She had seen love tested and survive. Her parents were not perfect, but they were present. They argued, forgave, and chose each other repeatedly. To Ira, love was not about grand gestures, it was about consistency. She believed that emotional honesty was the highest form of courage, and she carried that belief into everything she did. From the first production meeting, Ira challenged Ayaan, not directly but naturally. When he suggested removing an emotional pause from a scene, calling it unnecessary sentiment, Ira calmly responded, "Sometimes silence says what dialogue can't." The room fell quiet. Ayaan looked at her for the first time, not as a junior, but as a contradiction to everything he believed. He dismissed the comment professionally, but something about it stayed with him longer than it should have. Over the next few weeks, their interactions increased. Long hours on set forced collaboration. Ira noticed how Ayaan avoided personal conversations. Ayaan noticed how Ira remembered small emotional details, an actor's hesitation, a crew member's exhaustion, the mood of a scene before it was spoken. She worked with empathy. He worked with precision. Together, they created balance, though neither acknowledged it. Ira was not single. She had been in a relationship with Samir Qureshi for over 3 years, a man admired by everyone around him. Samir was successful, composed, and dependable. He believed in planning, timelines, and measurable progress. He loved Ira in the way society approved of through security and structure. Their relationship looked ideal from the outside. But inside, Ira often felt like she was explaining herself instead of being understood. Samir listened, but rarely felt. He was present physically, but emotionally efficient. Ira told herself that love matured with time. That passion softened into partnership. Still, something inside her resisted complete surrender. Ayaan noticed Samir only because Ira mentioned him occasionally. He didn't feel jealousy, at least, not in a way he recognized. But he found himself observing how Ira spoke about her relationship. She never criticized Samir. She simply paused more than usual when she spoke of him. Those pauses unsettled Ayaan. He had built his life around avoiding emotional pauses. One evening, after a particularly long shoot, Ayaan and Ira sat reviewing footage. The scene on screen was emotional, two characters choosing each other despite uncertainty. Ayaan commented mechanically on camera angles. Ira watched silently. Then she said softly, "Do you ever wonder why people still believe in love even after seeing it fail so many times?" Ayaan shrugged. "Because they like comforting lies," he replied. Ira didn't argue. She smiled gently and said, "Or because some truths are worth the risk." That night, Ayaan couldn't sleep. He replayed the conversation in his mind, irritated by how easily her words unsettled him. He told himself it was exhaustion, curiosity, nothing more. But deep down, something had shifted, something subtle, like the first crack in ice that pretends to be solid. And somewhere between logic and memory, the man who refused to believe had begun to feel something dangerously unfamiliar. Ayaan Verma began noticing changes in himself that he refused to name. They were small at first, harmless, almost invisible. He started arriving on set earlier than usual, telling himself it was professionalism. He paid closer attention to Ira's suggestions, not because they were better than his own, but because he wanted to hear her speak. When she wasn't around, something in the air felt unfinished, as if a sentence had been left half-written. Ayaan hated that feeling. He liked conclusions. He liked control. And yet, with Ira, everything felt suspended, neither beginning nor ending, just quietly unfolding. Ira, on the other hand, sensed a shift she couldn't explain either. Ayaan was still reserved, still careful with his words, but his silences had changed. They were no longer dismissive, they were thoughtful. Sometimes she caught him watching her, not in a way that felt invasive, but as if he was trying to understand something unfamiliar. Ira was used to being admired, but this was different. Ayaan wasn't looking at her beauty or charm. He was studying her presence. And that unsettled her more than attention ever could. Their conversations deepened without intention. Late-night shoots turned into quiet discussions about art, fear, and the invisible weight people carried. Ira spoke about emotions the way one speaks about whether natural, unpredictable, necessary. Ayaan listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words were measured, carefully filtered through logic. Yet sometimes, between sentences, Ira sensed emotions he didn't allow himself to express. One night, while reviewing a scene about emotional abandonment, Ira casually mentioned how silence could hurt more than anger. The words were not meant for Ayaan, but they landed where he kept his past hidden. He didn't respond. He simply nodded and moved on. But later, alone in his apartment, memories surfaced. His mother setting an extra plate at dinner, the quiet hum of the television filling spaces where conversations should have been. For the first time in years, Ayaan didn't push the memory away. He let it sit. It frightened him. Meanwhile, Ira's relationship with Samir continued as it always had, smooth, predictable, safe. Samir called regularly, checked in responsibly, and spoke about their future with certainty. Marriage, investments, stability. Everything sounded right. Yet Ira felt herself growing quieter during their conversations. When she spoke about her day, Samir listened politely, but his responses were solutions, not understanding. He fixed things before feeling them. Ira didn't doubt his intentions. She doubted his emotional availability. One evening, Ira mentioned a difficult scene she had worked on. Samir replied, "That's just work stress. Once we're settled, things like this won't matter." The comment was meant to comfort her. Instead, it made her feel unseen. Ira realized she wasn't asking for solutions. She was asking to be felt, and she wondered silently when that gap had formed. Back on set, Ayaan noticed Ira's mood shifting before she did. He sensed when her energy dimmed, when her smiles felt practiced. He didn't ask questions, but he adjusted. He made space. He stayed present. These small acts confused him. Caring was not part of his design, and yet he found himself invested in her emotional state in ways he could not logically justify. The more time they spent together, the harder it became for Ayaan to maintain emotional distance. He began questioning his long-held beliefs, not aggressively but curiously. What if love wasn't a lie but a risk? What if the problem wasn't love itself but the fear of losing control? These thoughts unsettled him deeply. Ayaan had built his identity around certainty. Doubt threatened everything. For Ira, the confusion came differently. She felt loyal to Samir and guilty for the comfort she found in Ayaan's presence. She reminded herself that emotional safety did not equal romantic intention. Yet she couldn't ignore the way she felt heard around Ayaan. Not adored, not managed, simply understood. One afternoon during a break, Ira laughed freely at something Ayaan said, a rare, unguarded laugh. The sound startled him. For a moment, the world narrowed to that single expression of joy. Ayaan felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't desire. It wasn't attraction. It was something quieter and more dangerous, attachment. That night, Ayaan confronted himself honestly for the first time. He admitted what he had been avoiding. Ira mattered. And that scared him more than heartbreak ever had, because heartbreak ended pain. Attachment promised it. He told himself to pull back, to restore distance, to return to control. But emotions, once acknowledged, do not retreat quietly. And somewhere between restraint and longing, the foundation Ayaan had built his life on began to crack, slowly, silently, and irreversibly. By the time the third month of the project began, the distance between what Ayaan felt and what he allowed himself to show had become exhausting. Control, once his greatest strength, now felt like a constant performance. He was still efficient, still respected, still emotionally reserved on the surface. But inside, something restless moved without permission. Ira had become a presence he could not switch off. Not because she demanded attention, but because she existed honestly, and honesty had a way of unsettling carefully built walls. Ayaan started noticing patterns in himself that alarmed him. He remembered details about Ira without trying, the way she tapped her pen when thinking, how she paused before disagreeing, how her voice softened when she spoke about things that mattered. These were not romantic observations, he told himself. They were habits of proximity, professional familiarity, nothing more. But every time he attempted to reduce her importance in his mind, his thoughts circled back to her with quiet persistence. Ira, too, was becoming aware of a shift she could no longer ignore. Being around Ayaan felt emotionally grounding in a way she hadn't experienced before. He didn't overwhelm her with affection or expectations. He didn't try to impress her. He simply existed with her, in conversation, in silence, in shared focus. That presence felt rare and dangerous. Ira reminded herself that comfort could be misleading, that emotional connection did not always mean love. Still, she couldn't deny the sense of ease she felt with him, an ease that contrasted sharply with the careful effort her relationship with Samir now required. Samir noticed the change before Ira did. It wasn't dramatic, no arguments, no accusations, just pauses. Ira was quieter on calls, less enthusiastic about future plans. When Samir spoke about timelines and commitments, Ira responded thoughtfully but without excitement. Samir attributed it to work stress at first. He trusted logic more than intuition, but logic couldn't explain the growing emotional gap he felt. One evening, Samir surprised Ira by visiting her set unannounced. He watched from a distance as Ira discussed a scene with Ayaan, calm, engaged, animated in a way Samir hadn't seen in months. There was no physical closeness, no obvious intimacy, yet something about their interaction unsettled him. It wasn't romance he sensed, it was understanding. And understanding, Samir realized, could be far more threatening. That night, Samir asked Ira directly if something was wrong. Ira hesitated, not because she wanted to lie, but because she didn't yet understand the truth herself. She said she felt overwhelmed, uncertain, stretched between responsibilities. Samir accepted the answer, but the doubt remained. He suggested spending more time together, reconnecting. Ira agreed, hoping clarity would come with effort. Meanwhile, Ayaan made a decision that surprised even him. He tried to distance himself from Ira. He reduced unnecessary interactions, kept conversations professional, and avoided lingering moments. He told himself this was the responsible choice, that whatever was forming needed to stop before it crossed into something irreversible. But emotional withdrawal is never invisible. Ira noticed immediately. The change hurt her more than she expected, not because she felt rejected romantically, but because she felt the loss of emotional safety. Ayaan's absence created a silence she hadn't prepared for. She wondered if she had imagined their connection, if she had projected meaning where none existed. The thought made her question her own instincts, something she had always trusted. One late night after an exhausting shoot, Ira finally confronted Ayaan, not angrily but honestly. She asked him why he had pulled away. Ayaan looked at her for a long moment, weighing truth against self-preservation. He chose the latter. He told her he needed space, that things had become too familiar, too personal. His voice was steady, his words controlled, but Ira heard what he didn't say. For the first time, Ira saw fear in Ayaan, not loud or dramatic, but restrained and heavy. It made her understand something painful. Ayaan wasn't indifferent. He was afraid. That realization changed everything. Ira walked away that night with clarity she hadn't wanted. Whatever existed between them was real, not because it was romantic, but because it mattered enough to be feared. She returned home to Samir, feeling more divided than ever. Loyalty pulled her one way, truth pulled her another. And Ayaan, alone in his apartment, realized that distance hadn't freed him. It had confirmed what he was trying to deny. He didn't just care about Ira. He was already losing her. The following weeks brought no relief. Ayaan could no longer pretend that distance had erased the growing weight of Ira's presence in his life. Every day he avoided her, his mind replayed their conversations, her smiles, her quiet reassurances, her laughter that had somehow become a rhythm he unconsciously anticipated. Sleep, once a refuge, had become restless hours of reflection. He tried logic, tried work, even tried distraction. But his heart, the part he had tightly guarded for decades, refused to obey. The man who had once mocked love now wrestled with its undeniable grip. Ira, too, was caught in a storm of conflicting emotions. Her heart knew Ayaan had become vital to her well-being. She felt safer around him than she ever had with Samir, yet she struggled to define the nature of that safety. It was not flirtation or passion, it was understanding. Emotional presence. The rare, intangible quality that allowed someone to exist beside you and still see the depths of your mind without judgment. Every time Ayaan spoke, every time he listened, Ira felt the pull of something she could not yet name, a truth she feared to acknowledge. Samir, ever practical and disciplined, began noticing cracks in their relationship that could no longer be explained away. He saw the way Ira's eyes softened when she mentioned Ayaan, the slight hesitation in her tone, the quiet longing she seemed unable to conceal. Samir was not jealous by nature, but he recognized that love cannot thrive on mere plans and timelines alone. It requires connection, raw, unpredictable, emotional connection. And while he could provide stability, he could not provide what she now unconsciously sought: presence, acknowledgement, and understanding. This realization disturbed him more than confrontation ever could. The tension escalated one evening on set when a complicated emotional scene required improvisation. Ira hesitated mid-dialogue, and Ayaan instinctively filled the space, not with his own lines, but with a gentle suggestion, a subtle shift that brought out a truth in her performance. Their eyes met briefly. And the weight of unspoken understanding passed between them. Neither spoke, yet everything was said. Ira felt her heartbeat quicken. Ayaan's chest tightened. For the first time, it was clear, emotional detachment had been broken. Fear had taken root. Afterward, as the crew celebrated the success of the scene, Samir visited unexpectedly. He had sensed the shift. He approached Ayaan not with anger, not with accusation, but with measured curiosity. "Is there something between you two?" Samir asked, his voice calm but eyes alert. Ayaan froze. He could have denied it, deflected, or remained professional. But for the first time, denial felt dishonest. He hesitated, then said, "I respect her deeply, that's all." Samir studied him. He could sense that Ayaan's control was fragile, but he could not yet claim victory or loss. The emotional battlefield had just begun. Meanwhile, Ira's internal struggle grew unbearable. She returned home that night to Samir, intending to embrace the comfort of normalcy. Instead, she found herself questioning every choice she had made. Was security truly love if it left the heart restless? Was loyalty a virtue if it silenced truth? She realized that emotional honesty, long suppressed, had begun to demand acknowledgement. And she feared the cost. Choices now mattered more than consequences. She felt herself at a crossroads, a point where life demanded clarity. Ayaan, sensing his own limitations, decided to confront his truth head-on. Late one night alone, he reviewed every interaction he had shared with Ira, the subtle gestures, the unguarded moments, the silences that had spoken louder than words. He understood that what he felt was neither fleeting nor trivial. It was attachment. It was fear of loss. It was the first genuine love he had allowed himself in decades. And he recognized the paradox. The only way to protect himself was to risk everything. In the quiet of that night, Ayaan made a decision. He would no longer hide from what he felt. He would not retreat under the guise of caution. He would speak. The only uncertainty was timing. The only question was reception. For someone who had meticulously avoided vulnerability all his life, acknowledging his heart felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, terrifying, necessary, irreversible. And so the story reached a pivotal point. The equilibrium that had defined their lives, the balance of distance, the safety of detachment was shattered. The next steps would demand courage from all three. Ayaan, who feared emotional collapse, Ira, who feared choosing between loyalty and truth, and Samir, who faced the dawning reality that love cannot be measured by planning alone. The calm had ended. Emotion had returned, and nothing would ever be the same. The night came softly, almost deceptively calm, yet it carried the weight of all the unspoken emotions between Ayaan and Ira. The film set had emptied hours ago, leaving only the lingering hum of equipment and the faint smell of coffee and warm lights. Ira remained behind, revising the script, unaware that Ayaan had returned to finalize scene edits. Their paths crossed in the dimly lit corridor, and suddenly the air between them was charged, heavy with every unacknowledged moment they had shared over the past months. Ayaan paused. For weeks, he had rehearsed how he might manage the conversation, how he might shield himself and maintain his identity as the man who feared vulnerability. But rehearsals were useless now. His heart had taken control, leaving reason in the shadows. Ira noticed the change instantly, the slight hesitation in his step, the tension in his shoulders, the unusual softness in his gaze. She didn't speak. She waited. She had learned from experience that moments like these demanded patience. Finally, words emerged, not fluent, not polished, but raw in their honesty. "Ira, I can't keep pretending anymore," Ayaan said, his voice steady but low. "I've avoided this feeling for months, convinced myself it was nothing. But it's not nothing. I care about you, more than I thought I could, more than I ever wanted to admit." His eyes searched hers, seeking a reaction, a permission, a truth that matched his own. For the first time, the man who had always avoided emotion exposed himself completely. Ira felt her chest tighten. Every rational voice screamed that this confession was dangerous. She was with Samir, safe, committed, socially approved. But every instinct in her body whispered that the truth she had ignored for so long was finally demanding recognition. "Ayaan, she began, but the words faltered. She could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet, the solidity of her past loyalties crumbling, piece by piece. Ayaan stepped closer, the hesitation that had defined him for years dissolving into urgency. "I know you're with Samir," he said softly. "I know this complicates everything, but I can't stay silent anymore. I can't pretend I'm indifferent. If I don't tell you now, I might never get the chance to be honest again." There was no accusation, no demand, only the unbearable weight of sincerity. And that weight fell squarely on Ira, leaving her stunned by the clarity of his emotions. The room felt smaller, constricted by unsaid truths and lingering glances. Ira's mind raced, flitting between loyalty and instinct. She remembered Samir's dependable voice, his measured presence, the comfort of familiarity. And yet, in that instant, all of that comfort felt pale, lifeless, and incomplete. Ayaan's confession had awakened a depth of feeling she had ignored for months. A realization struck her. Love, genuine love, was not something to plan or schedule. It was something to feel wholly and irreversibly. Meanwhile, Samir had been noticing cracks that were impossible to ignore. In his absence, subtle changes in Ira's behavior had begun to haunt him. Pauses in conversation, glances toward empty spaces, moments of distraction that made him uneasy. He had initially dismissed them as work stress or fatigue. But now, he began sensing the unspoken bond that had been forming between Ira and Ayaan. The realization unsettled him more than confrontation ever could. For the first time, he understood that love could not be controlled through planning, structure, or social expectations. Presence mattered more than everything else. Ira, trembling between loyalty and truth, finally spoke. "Ayaan, this changes everything. But it doesn't erase my life with Samir. I need to think. I need to understand what my heart is actually asking for." Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the storm within. Ayaan nodded. He did not demand immediate clarity. He only allowed his honesty to exist in the room, a mirror reflecting all the emotions they had tried to deny. It was a rare moment of pure, unfiltered connection. That night, Ayaan returned home exhausted, yet strangely lighter. He had stepped out of the cage of control he had built over decades. He knew the path ahead would be difficult, messy, and uncertain. But for the first time in his life, he understood that emotional truth could not be avoided without losing oneself entirely. And Ira, somewhere in her apartment, was feeling the same turbulence, a reckoning that would force decisions, consequences, and courage in equal measure. Thus, the first undeniable confrontation had occurred. The equilibrium had been broken. Ayaan had exposed his heart. Ira had acknowledged its presence. And Samir, meanwhile, sensed that nothing would remain unchanged. In the coming days, choices would be forced, loyalties tested, and hearts compelled to declare what they truly desired. The story had crossed the threshold from hesitation to irreversible movement, and there was no turning back. The morning after Ayaan's confession, the world felt heavier for Ira. She woke up with a restless mind and an anxious heart. Every detail of the previous night, the way his words trembled with sincerity, the intensity in his eyes, the raw honesty she had witnessed, haunted her. She tried to focus on Samir, to remind herself of stability, familiarity, and everything she had believed love should feel like. But every memory of Ayaan pushed that comfort aside. She realized, painfully, that loyalty could not replace truth. Love could not be commanded. It could only be lived. Samir noticed her distance immediately. The calmness that once defined their relationship had dissolved into unease. At breakfast, he watched her stir her coffee absent-mindedly, her gaze lingering somewhere beyond the window. He spoke cautiously, testing for reassurance. "Everything all right?" Ira nodded, but the silence that followed told him more than words ever could. Samir understood instinctively that something had changed, something that was beyond schedules, plans, and promises. For the first time, he felt the vulnerability of losing someone not to betrayal, but to emotional truth. Ira knew she could no longer avoid confrontation. Later that day, she asked Samir to meet her in the quiet of their apartment. The air was thick with anticipation, heavy with unspoken truths. She sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly, voice barely above a whisper. "Samir, I need to be honest," she began. "I've realized something about myself, about my heart. I can't pretend anymore." Her eyes filled with tears, the weight of months of denial pressing down. Samir's expression shifted from calm to concerned. "What are you saying?" he asked gently, bracing himself. I care about someone else," she admitted. "I didn't plan this, I didn't want it, but it's real and I can't ignore it." Samir felt a moment of shock, not because of anger, but because reality had finally arrived in a way he could not structure or control. He had always believed that love could be managed, measured, contained. Now he realized it could not. Emotions do not adhere to rules. They do not respect plans. They demand honesty, whether convenient or not. Meanwhile, Ayaan waited at a distance, unsure of how Ira would navigate the conversation. He understood that this was a storm he could not enter yet, a moment Ira had to face alone. He knew the consequences could be devastating, relationships shattered, reputations questioned, hearts broken, but he had long stopped fearing consequences. Emotional truth mattered more than the safety of avoidance. Back in the apartment, Ira's confession continued. She described the way Ayaan made her feel seen, not idealized, not adored superficially, but truly understood. She spoke of moments on set, small gestures, subtle attention that had awakened feelings she could not ignore. Samir listened, pained but respectful. He understood that Ira's heart had chosen its path, not out of malice but from necessity. He loved her enough to hear her truth, but not enough to ignore its cost. Ayaan, in the shadows outside, felt every word resonate within him. The reality of their situation, His confession, Ira's honesty, Samir's acknowledgement made the stakes painfully clear. He could no longer retreat into detachment. He had exposed his heart, and now he had to live with whatever consequences followed. There was no turning back, no pretending. The emotional equilibrium that had once allowed him control had collapsed entirely. By evening, the three of them existed in a delicate, invisible balance. Ira knew that a decision loomed, the need to choose truth over comfort, authenticity over stability. Samir wrestled with loss, understanding that love sometimes demands sacrifice. And Ayaan, despite his fear, realized that courage and honesty could not be measured by certainty. They could only be embraced. Each heartbeat, each glance, each word had become a step toward inevitable confrontation and resolution. As the night fell, Ayaan sat alone in his apartment, replaying Ira's expressions, the tremor in her voice, the sincerity in her words. He had hoped for clarity, for a sign, for permission from fate. Yet he understood that love was never about permission. It was about action, about choice, about willingness to be vulnerable. And he was willing, more than willing. He had already lost control over his heart, but in that loss he found freedom. Freedom to feel, to risk, to love. The story had reached its tipping point. Emotional truths had been spoken. Loyalties had been challenged. Hearts had been laid bare. And the inevitable path forward, fraught with courage, confusion, and raw human emotion, was about to unfold. Ayaan and Ira's journey could no longer be paused. The consequences of honesty, desire, and inevitability were about to collide. The morning sun poured through the apartment windows, illuminating a space that had become heavy with unspoken emotions. Ira sat at the small dining table, a cup of untouched tea in her hands, staring at the steam rising and curling into the air. Her thoughts were tangled, chaotic, a battlefield of loyalty and longing. Samir had been patient, compassionate, and silent during their discussion the previous night, yet the quiet magnified the distance between them. Every measured word he had spoken, every calm gesture, seemed like an elegant cage, safe but restrictive. Ira realized she could not live in that cage anymore. Her heart was no longer quiet. It demanded honesty. Samir watched her carefully, his own emotions a mixture of sorrow and admiration. He knew that the love he had built with Ira, trust, security, structure, was not enough to fill the space her heart now occupied. He had always believed that love could be guided, shaped, even protected through logic, but he now faced a reality that refused guidance, shape, or control. Ira's gaze met his briefly, steady, and vulnerable. "I have to follow my heart," she said softly. "I can't ignore this anymore." It was not accusation, not blame. It was truth. Samir's chest tightened, and for a moment he wondered if love was truly about holding on or about letting go. Meanwhile, Ayaan sat across town in his quiet apartment, rehearsing the conversation he had been imagining for weeks. He had told himself that he must be patient, that he must respect the process, that Ira's decision could not be rushed. Yet his fingers drummed unconsciously on the table, a rhythm betraying the tension he could no longer contain. Months of restraint, of avoidance, of detachment, had culminated in this moment. He understood fully now. Love, once acknowledged, could not be ignored. He was willing to face whatever followed, risk, rejection, heartbreak, because silence was no longer an option. When Ira finally reached him, it was not a confrontation but a meeting of mutual understanding. The room seemed smaller than usual, filled with the weight of anticipation, unsaid words, and mutual awareness. They stood facing each other, not with urgency, but with a tension that made every breath deliberate. "Ayaan," she said quietly, "I need to know if this is real for you. Not theoretical, not convenient, not imagined." Her eyes searched his. His lips parted, hesitated, then formed the words that had been restrained for months. "It's real. More real than anything I've ever allowed myself to feel. I can't pretend anymore. I don't want to." The admission hung between them like a delicate thread, vibrating with emotion. Ira's hands trembled slightly as she reached for his. It was the first gesture of complete vulnerability, the first moment where pretense vanished entirely. Ayaan, in turn, allowed himself to lean closer, not out of possession but presence, showing her, without words, that he would carry this truth with respect, care, and unwavering attention. For the first time in his life, he was fully visible. And Ira understood the magnitude of what that visibility meant. Back at her apartment, Samir felt the finality of the choice he had known was coming. He loved Ira, deeply and genuinely, yet he also understood that love cannot be forced into the shape of expectation. He had offered her everything he could give: security, patience, calm, and yet the truth of her heart belonged elsewhere. The realization was devastating, but it was also enlightening. He could not control another person's heart without losing his own integrity. And so, with heavy dignity, he stepped back, allowing the path of truth to unfold, no matter how painful. Ayaan and Ira spent that day together, not with dramatic gestures, but with slow, deliberate conversation. They spoke about fears, past wounds, and expectations. Ira confessed the guilt and hesitation she had carried for months. Ayaan admitted the depth of his fear of vulnerability, of losing control, and of finally being forced to feel beyond defense. Each revelation, though difficult, created trust. Each shared silence carried meaning. Their connection was no longer tentative. It was deliberate, honest, and evolving into something profound. By evening, the emotional storm had subsided into a calm certainty. Ira had chosen truth over comfort. Ayaan had allowed himself to love without shields. Samir, though hurting, had accepted the boundaries of his role in her story. The equilibrium that had defined their lives, the safety of detachment, the predictability of loyalty, the convenience of avoidance was gone. In its place was something fragile, imperfect, yet alive: mutual acknowledgement, choice, and the tentative first steps of genuine love. The city lights outside mirrored the quiet intensity within. Ayaan and Ira sat together, hands intertwined, facing a future both uncertain and exhilarating. For the first time, emotion had won over logic. Vulnerability had triumphed over fear. And in that space, where hearts were allowed to be honest, life itself seemed possible, radiant, and infinitely more real than any story they had ever watched or lived before. The days following Ira's choice were both exhilarating and fragile. Ayaan and Ira walked through the city together as if seeing it for the first time, not in the sense of novelty, but with awareness heightened by every shared heartbeat. Small gestures, a brush of hands, a shared smile, a word spoken with complete attention, carried the weight of months of suppressed longing. Every glance and pause was deliberate, tender, and full of unspoken promises. It was not a love rushed by urgency, but a love unfolding deliberately, as two hearts cautiously learned to trust their own truth. The public consequences, however, were unavoidable. The film crew whispered about the shift in dynamic, noting the subtle but undeniable closeness between Ayaan and Ira. Friends and colleagues began asking questions, some innocuous, some intrusive. Ayaan, who had spent his life maintaining control over perception, felt discomfort he had never experienced before. Yet Ira's presence beside him provided a grounding calm. She reminded him that authenticity, though challenging, was more fulfilling than curated appearances. Together, they navigated the subtle politics of observation, holding onto each other amid curiosity and judgment. Meanwhile, Samir had retreated to process his own emotions. The man who had believed that love could be managed by planning now faced the stark reality that love was unpredictable, uncontainable, and deeply human. He had loved Ira as best as he could, but the timing and depth of her emotions were beyond his influence. Samir chose dignity over confrontation, and in doing so, he allowed Ira and Ayaan the space to explore their newfound connection without guilt. It was painful, quiet, and permanent, a farewell without dramatics but laden with significance. Ayaan and Ira began spending long hours together outside of work, sharing moments both mundane and profound. Coffee in small cafes, walks along quiet streets, and evenings reviewing scripts at Ayaan's apartment became a rhythm of trust and intimacy. They talked about fears, hopes, and the kind of love they wanted to cultivate, one grounded in honesty rather than expectation, presence rather than perfection. Every interaction was an exercise in emotional literacy, teaching them how to navigate vulnerability while honoring the past they each carried. As their relationship deepened, the couple faced subtle challenges. Ayaan's habit of control occasionally resurfaced, manifesting in protective behaviors or strategic silence. Ira's loyalty and conscience caused her to pause, reflect, and question if they were moving too fast. Each challenge, however, became an opportunity for growth. Conversations that might have been avoided in the past were now embraced as necessary for sustaining connection. Their bond was not effortless. It was intentional, built on patience, dialogue, and courage. public acknowledgement of their connection remained delicate. While coworkers noticed, it was not yet time for grand declarations. Ayaan and Ira understood that love was not performative. It did not need validation to exist. Yet slowly, the warmth of mutual acknowledgement spread beyond the private moments. Small acts, hand-holding in passing, subtle gestures of care, became visible markers of commitment without the need for proclamation. They learned that intimacy could be quiet, yet no less significant. Samir's presence, though distant, remained a reminder of the consequences of truth. He reached out occasionally, offering neutral support and ensuring that boundaries were respected. These gestures reinforced the complexity of human relationships. Love could coexist with loss, affection could remain even after separation, and respect could survive the breaking of bonds. Ira and Ayaan absorbed these lessons, realizing that love was never singular or simple. It was multidimensional, messy, and profoundly transformative. By now, the city around them had become a witness to their growth. The streets, the cafes, the film sets, they carried traces of laughter, conversation, and shared vulnerability. Ayaan, who had once believed emotions were dangerous, discovered that love did not demand surrender but presence. Ira, who had once feared disloyalty and indecision, found that choosing truth could lead to a deeper, more authentic connection. Together, they were learning that the price of honesty was steep, but the reward, freedom, intimacy, and clarity, was worth every risk. As night fell on one quiet evening, Ayaan and Ira sat together on the balcony of his apartment, city lights flickering like distant stars below. They spoke of the past without resentment, of fears without shame, and of dreams without expectation. Every word was a bridge between hearts that had been carefully guarded, tested, and finally revealed. In that moment, they understood the magnitude of their journey. Love had arrived not in grand declarations or idealized perfection, but through the patient, sometimes painful embrace of truth. And as they sat side by side, hands entwined, hearts aligned, the story of hesitation, fear, and emotional restraint reached a turning point. The foundations of doubt had been dismantled. What remained was raw, alive, and irreversible, a love not constructed by convenience, but forged in courage, honesty, and shared vulnerability. In the quiet of that balcony, Ayaan and Ira finally allowed themselves to simply exist together, fully, and without pretense. The city's skyline shimmered under the fading glow of twilight as Ayaan and Ira walked hand in hand, feeling the unfamiliar yet exhilarating weight of freedom. Their journey had been long, months of restraint, avoidance, and careful observation. But now, the distance between them had dissolved. Every moment, every glance, every word shared had been layered with the intensity of suppressed emotion finally released. And yet, with clarity came consequence. Life rarely allowed love to exist in isolation. The echoes of the past lingered, subtle and unavoidable. Samir had reached the point of acceptance. The man who had loved Ira with steadfast loyalty now understood that love is not possession. It is respect, courage, and sometimes letting go. He met with Ira one last time, not in confrontation, but in quiet acknowledgement. His voice carried calm finality. "Ira, I will always care for you, but your happiness is yours to choose. I see where your heart belongs, and I will step back." Ira felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and gratitude. Samir's grace reminded her that endings, though painful, could be dignified and kind. She embraced him briefly, the gesture a silent promise that memories could remain cherished without clinging to the past. Meanwhile, Ayaan's emotions had reached a rare state of transparency. The man who had once feared vulnerability now leaned fully into it, allowing himself to feel without resistance. Ira's presence beside him was not merely comforting, it was transformative. He spoke freely, not only of love but of fears, insecurities, and the anticipation of what their life together could entail. "Ira," he whispered, "I've spent my life hiding from emotions, from connection, from love itself. But with you, I finally understand. Love isn't about perfection or control. It's about courage, and I am ready to risk everything for it." Ira, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, smiled softly. "Ayaan, I've waited to feel this truth for years. I tried to suppress it for safety, for loyalty, for logic, but love is nothing if not authentic. And it's real. Fragile, yes, but real, and I choose it." Her hands found his, squeezing gently, a tactile affirmation of commitment. The tension that had defined their journey, the push and pull of fear, duty, and desire, finally dissolved into mutual acknowledgement. They had arrived at the point where honesty triumphed over hesitation. The city around them seemed to echo their internal transformation. The hum of traffic, the distant laughter of late-night cafes, the faint glow of neon signs, all became background to a moment that was intensely personal yet universally resonant. The story of avoidance, control, and unspoken longing had culminated here, not in spectacle, but in quiet truth. Every whispered word, every gentle touch, carried the weight of months of emotional restraint, finally given permission to breathe and exist fully. In the following days, Ayaan and Ira navigated the delicate balance of public acknowledgement. Colleagues began to notice, yet the couple maintained grace and subtlety. They allowed their bond to be visible without fanfare, demonstrating that love need not be performative to be profound. Ayaan, once a master of detachment, learned to integrate emotion into daily life without fear. Ira, once cautious of loyalty and consequence, embraced truth without guilt. Together, they discovered a new rhythm, one in which love was intentional, patient, and deeply grounding. Samir, though absent from daily interactions, remained a silent testament to emotional maturity. His acceptance had freed both Ira and Ayaan from guilt, resentment, or lingering obligation. The lessons learned from his presence, the complexity of love, the inevitability of consequence, and the dignity of letting go became foundational in shaping the couple's understanding of their relationship. They realized that love was never solitary. It coexisted with history, sacrifice, and responsibility. By the end of the week, Ayaan and Ira found themselves alone on the same balcony where previous conversations had shifted from curiosity to confession. City lights flickered below like distant constellations, and the hum of life seemed to synchronize with their own pulse. They spoke not of the past, nor of future worries, but of the simple truth of being present. Every moment became a meditation on intimacy, courage, and shared existence. No dramatics, no spectacle, just two hearts aligned, finally liberated from fear and uncertainty. In that space, the culmination of months of emotional tension found its resolution. The story of avoidance, unspoken longing, fear, and consequence had reached its emotional peak. Ayaan and Ira's love was not perfect. It was tested, vulnerable, and wholly authentic. It existed because they had chosen honesty over convenience, presence over detachment, courage over fear. And in this choice, they discovered the rarest of treasures, a love that was both deeply personal and universally meaningful. Months had passed since Ira and Ayaan had made the choice that changed everything. Life had settled into a rhythm both unpredictable and comforting. The bond that had been forged through hesitation, fear, and emotional confrontation had matured into a love tempered by honesty, patience, and understanding. It was not a love of fairy tales or flawless perfection. It was real, raw, and profoundly human. Ayaan had transformed in ways he had never imagined possible. The man who had spent decades avoiding emotion, controlling perception, and shunning vulnerability now embraced feelings openly. He laughed without reservation, expressed affection without hesitation, and allowed Ira's presence to influence not only his heart, but his daily life. Work, once a refuge from intimacy, became a shared space where collaboration was enriched by mutual respect and emotional insight. He was no longer just the calm, controlled professional. He was fully alive, fully engaged, and fully in love. Ira, too, had grown into the courage of her choice. She had learned that truth, though difficult, carried a freedom no loyalty could provide. The lingering guilt she had once felt for leaving Samir behind had transformed into gratitude, for lessons learned, for emotional resilience, for clarity. Her heart was no longer split, no longer burdened by compromise. With Ayaan, she discovered a partnership where understanding and authenticity thrived. Their love was deliberate, nurturing, and profoundly transformative. Samir, meanwhile, had found his own peace. Though he experienced the ache of loss, he chose to see Ira's happiness as validation of his own love's depth. He understood that love was not possession, but respect and courage. He continued his life with dignity, carrying no bitterness, only lessons about the complexity of human emotion, the inevitability of change, and the nobility of letting go. His role in the story had ended, not with tragedy, but with quiet grace. The city around them became a silent witness to their love. Streets they had walked together, cafes where laughter had been shared, and late-night film sets where confessions had unfolded, all held echoes of their journey. Yet the focus of their lives was now inward, centered on the emotional harmony they had fought to create. Their connection was no longer tentative or hidden. It was resilient, honest, and alive. Ayaan and Ira faced challenges as all couples do. Misunderstandings, minor conflicts, and the inevitable uncertainties of life arose, but they approached each obstacle with the tools they had honed over months: communication, patience, and vulnerability. Every challenge was met not with avoidance, but with presence. Every misstep was an opportunity to deepen understanding. They had learned that love was not a static emotion, but an evolving practice, a conscious choice made each day. Together, they began envisioning a future that blended passion, companionship, and shared purpose. Discussions of home, career, and dreams were no longer exercises in compromise, but collaborative planning. Their love, forged in fire, had become the foundation of a life they both wanted to build. Ayaan had learned to trust in Ira's instincts. Ira had learned to honor her own heart without fear. Each step forward was a celebration of honesty, courage, and resilience. The final moments of their story were quiet yet cinematic. One evening, on a balcony overlooking the city lights, Ayaan turned to Ira and took her hands in his. "We've come a long way," he said, voice soft but steady. "Through fear, through doubt, through everything we never thought we could face. But here we are together, fully." Ira smiled, eyes glistening, feeling the weight of every moment they had survived and the promise of every moment yet to come. "Together," she echoed, "always." The city hummed below, indifferent to their personal triumph, yet somehow reflective of it. The lights like stars, the movement like breathing, the quiet rhythm echoing their own hearts. They sat together, hands entwined, embracing the simplicity and profundity of the moment. No words were needed beyond presence, no grand gestures beyond honesty. Theirs was a love not scripted by circumstance, but written through choice, courage, and truth. And in that quiet, infinite space, Ayaan and Ira finally understood the greatest lesson of all. Love cannot be avoided, controlled, or predicted. It can only be felt, nurtured, and honored. And when it is, it becomes more than emotion. It becomes life itself.